Muy buenos días, estimados compañeros y amigos. Les reiteramos la más cordial bienvenida al evento internacional Global Glance, tu ventana al mundo, que desde la Dirección General de Internacionalización y el Comité Estratégico de Cultura y Pensamiento Global se ha organizado con mucho entusiasmo a toda nuestra comunidad de UPAEP. Este importante evento se llevó con la intención de contribuir al logro de la visión institucional en el marco del 50 aniversario que establece en su cuarta línea rectora, la necesidad de involucrarse en la formación y desarrollo intercultural de la comunidad universitaria a través de ámbitos y vínculos de internacionalización. Para continuar con las actividades de este significativo evento, nos sentimos honrados con la amable presencia del Dr. Sumantra Sengupta, de quien mencionaremos su semblanza curricular. To continue with the activities of this significant event, we're honored with the kind presence of Dr. Sumantra Sengupta, whose curriculum we will mention. Dr. Sengupta, Dean School of Business and Management at City University of Seattle, is an educator, entrepreneur, general manager, and turnaround strategist with 30+ years of experience in growing and streamlining global business and academic units from inception to growth levels greater than 10+. He joined CDU in 2021 after spending 25+ years in the private sector, where he held positions such as Vice President for Capgemini Ernst & Young, Hitachi Consulting, as well as Senior Executive Advisor with a global strategy firm. In 2010, he co-founded an advisory and turnaround firm, EBM Partners LLC, and conducted global turnarounds, including serving as group president for a diversified MNC with operations in 11 countries and 2,500 associates. Dr. Sengupta is a frequent speaker at conferences and has authored 6 books in various topics of globalization and supply chain management operations. He holds a PhD in business administration from Fisher's College of Business at Ohio State University, a Master of Arts degree in Business Administration from the State University. He also holds a master's degree and bachelor degree in Applied Mathematics from Ohio University. Dr. Sumantra Sengupta will give his dissertation on corporate and competitive strategy. Let us welcome him with a warm applause.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me back there? Good to see another face again. Yes? Thank you. First off, thank you for inviting me here. I actually haven't been to this side of Mexico since 2006. 2006 was the last time I didn't come to Puebla. I was in Mexico City when I was doing some work for a company called Grupo Gamesa. They were owned by Pepsi, and I was at Booz Allen Hamilton at that point, and so I was visiting. Can you guys hear me, or is it now? Oh, I have to keep it. I should have watched her. She was this thing. Can you guys hear me back there? Yeah? Are you guys from Germany? Yeah. You were on time. That's why I knew you were from Germany. Everybody else, we were just late. We strolled in. I have 8 German students that came last term, and it's always amazing. They all come together at the same time. They're always 2 minutes before class starts. It's perfect. German precision, I enjoy it. As it was a pleasure. Yesterday, the 2 tremor drills one was a drill, one was a real tremor, right? And remember, I live in Los Angeles, so earthquakes and tremors don't bother me because we're used to that. Fires bother us because we have a lot of brush fires. So when I was putting together this presentation, I was thinking, okay, what do I want to talk about with you guys? I spent about, how do I change there it is. As Alberto said, I got my PhD many years ago. When I look at the students, I got my PhD before all of you were born, right? I got my PhD, completed it in 1995 from Fisher School of Business. I was a mathematician, and after getting a couple of degrees in applied math, I realized that, number one, it was not my passion, and number two, I was very much a practical individual. I realized that it was going to be tough to have a commercially viable existence if I pursued math. Nothing against mathematicians, love them. I would have been one if I knew how to capitalize on it. So then I went to business school. I was like, where else to go? I showed up in business school. And back then, we really didn't have a lot of structure. I wanted to do quantitative methods, which is what I've done my whole career. My entire career has been finance and restructuring, a lot of operations, but very much on the quantitative side. So my advisor said, you know what? Just go to the industrial engineering department for half your courses, go to the business school for the other half of your courses, and then we'll figure out what your dissertation needs to be. Keep in mind, this is 1993. So after I finished, I got my first job with Kraft Foods, the cheese company. So I went up to Oscar Mayer, Madison, and they said, our hot dog line isn't working. We don't have enough throughput. We also don't really understand what the new trends are. Help us figure it out. So one of the first jobs I had, and it was fascinating. I came out of grad school, right? What do you think? What do you do when you come out of grad school? You think you know everything, right? That's one thing, right? You think you know everything because in university you've been told you know everything. So I go up to Oscar Mayer, Madison, third floor of the factory. The factory in Madison was built this way. It was not built that way. And I see a small tray of, plastic trays coming through the production line. And the production line is all staffed by 7 people. They take 4 crackers, put it in. Then they take 4 pieces of cheese, they put it in. And then they take this product, which, I never thought it was tasty, and I still don't. It's sliced bologna, and they put it in. The product goes down, they seal it. And I'm standing there looking at it, and I'm going, A, I don't understand what this product is, and B, who in their right mind would eat this rubbish? Do you know what that product was? Any guess? How many of you have heard of Lunchables? It was the first Lunchable that was going off the line. My boss at that point was a gentleman by the name of Bob Eckert. He was not my boss. He was like the CEO. He ended up running Mattel years later. I remember sitting in a presentation going, these marketing people, I have no idea what they're doing because this is just going to cost us money. And I remember his presentation where he said, this product is going to be $1 billion brand. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. You mean there's going to be this many, and this was only this many people in the US that will eat this rubbish? And guess what? Lunchables is probably right now a $10 billion brand. It was the first time I realized that most of what I had learned in the textbook, in the real world, doesn't really work. It's the first time I realized that competitive strategy and corporate strategy probably was the furthest thing from anything that was written in the textbooks. Because had I followed the textbook, or had Bob Eckert followed the textbook, there was no known market. There was no data. This was pre-data, right? As in the last presentation you guys saw, this was, back then we didn't even have email. Lotus Notes was our email platform. Some of you will remember Lotus Notes, right? We didn't have all this Nielsen data, all the market analytics, business intelligence, nothing. There was no intelligence. It was gut. That was our intel. That was his intelligence. That's where I realized that in order to be successful in creating strategic plans and corporate strategy and competitive strategy, the first thing I'm going to need to do is learn how to forget everything I had learned in business school. That was my first lesson. Nothing against my business school faculty members, right? It's because back then, business schools taught you the fundamentals out of the textbook, right? And that's, now, by the way, even today, a lot of teaching is very fundamental out of the textbook, but there are enough people like me, like Dr. Pablo here, who we had careers before we came into academia, right? Now, some of us had careers that, and back then when I was thinking about it, I said, at some point, and I was one of the biggest employers, so I became a partner at Ernst & Young. And actually, for those of you from Europe, Capgemini bought us. So we became Capgemini Ernst & Young. Probably one of the worst transactions in the history of consulting transactions, right? 98% of the partners left within the first 3 years. I did too. I went and took a job with my largest account, which is what most consultants do. My largest account at that point, I had 2 accounts. I had one in Kansas City and one in Ohio. Ohio, my account was the Scotts Miracle-Gro, turf builder. They were in the consumer fertilizer business, Roundup. So I took a job with them. They had just made a big announcement to Wall Street that they wanted to improve their return on invested capital. And I'll come to that and how that kind of measure feeds into strategy. And that's where I had the good fortune of working with somebody who I consider probably one of the foremost strategists in the world, Michael Porter. He was actually on our board, and obscenely expensive individual, by the way, and I'm sure in his mind he was worth every dollar. But we could get half-an-hour chunks of his time. He would never fly commercial, by the way. There was always a private plane that had to go get him. That was the rule. You wanted Porter to come to Ohio, you sent a private plane to Boston. Or you went to Boston and did the presentation. And if you ever went to Boston, I never did. Most of my presentations were either in New York or in Ohio. I heard that at Harvard, he has his own building. It's not this thing. And he's an amazing individual, right? And I understood the theoretical underpinnings of competitive strategy, not so much corporate strategy, because most of his work is on competition, right? So that allowed me to see, and this was about 10, 12 years into my career, right? So the reason I mention this is coming out of business school, I knew a lot of textbook stuff. I had read every article, right? I had studied it in detail. Keep in mind, I grew up in India. So one thing we know how to do is learn textbooks. The Indian method, which I was part of until part of my undergrad, we are very focused on the textbook. For us, the way you pass an exam in India, back then, even today, most of it, you learn the textbook, you memorize the textbook, you take 100 of the same tests, because the 101st test will probably be a copy of one of the 100 tests. And that's pretty much how you are expected to go. It's superbly competitive. Keep in mind, there's 1.2 billion Indians competing for like 4,000 spots at the best engineering school called IIT. So every year, 260,000 people take that entrance exam, and only 4,000 people get in. So you can imagine the obscene level of competition that goes on in that environment. It is unhealthy. So as I grew in my own career, these topics, one of these days I'll change the slide. Nope, maybe tomorrow? Oh, no, it worked. These are the things that I wanted to talk about. Four different areas on what are the different types of strategy that I've had to apply as I have restructured companies and as I have grown companies. The last company that I ran was a company called Aldara, A-L-D-A-H-R-A. The company is owned by one of the rulers of Abu Dhabi, His Highness Sheikh Hamdan bin Zayed. And it was a very simple concept that he asked me to, not him, I never met the Sheikh, His Excellency Khadim, who was the vice chairman, he was a client. He said, Dr. Sumantra, they're very formal in that side of the world, right? They will never call you Sumantra. It is always Dr. Sumantra. In Asia, it's even this thing. They will actually put your title in the front. Senior Manager Sumantra, Vice President Sumantra, right? It's always Dr. Sumantra. Years later, he said, I bought a couple of companies. There is a need for food security in this world, which is very true. And for them, food security was for animals. Because in that part of the world, the number of sheep, goat, camels that you own is very important for the local economy. And because of the decreasing water level, they were not going to grow any more water-intensive crops. Alfalfa, and if any of you know alfalfa, because I tried growing it in parts of Mexico as well. Mexico actually grows some of the best alfalfa. However, getting it out of Mexico is an impossible task. So my venture in Mexico was not that successful. I was growing it in the middle of the country. They stopped growing because their water table kept decreasing, and so they had to conserve water for human consumption. And so for animal consumption, they said, we will import. So he said, this company, we are supplying Abu Dhabi, 1 million tons was my contract with the government of Abu Dhabi. But I need you to go figure out how I can get year-round supply. Because alfalfa is only grown for 2 or 3 months. Europe, for example, only grows alfalfa between the months of May and July. After that, Europe has no product. And the European alfalfa is very different than the US alfalfa. US grows alfalfa from April to about August. South Africa, because it's on the other side of the hemisphere, the growing season is exactly the opposite. So I had 2 jobs. He said, I need a year-round supply, which to me meant I had to go around the world buying companies so that I could get sources. And second, he said, we think there is a global market for this product because China had started importing. He said, do you think you can help us build a global company but not allow Cargill, Bunge, or ADM, the big trading companies, to realize that we are actually building a global trading company? Kind of, those were by the way, that was my assignment. So, and that was towards, that was the last assignment I did. So for somebody who had spent most of his career in consulting, by then I had spent about 22 years in consulting, right? If you're in consulting, you're advising the CEO on what to do. The CEO is probably looking at you going, yeah, but you've never done it. So what gives you the right to advise me on it, right? So it was always on my people have different weird bucket lists, right? You're supposed to have like visiting the pyramids on your bucket list, skydiving on your bucket list. On my bucket list was, I wanted to run a $1 billion company. Perverse like this. I don't even know why that was on my bucket list, but it was. So I took that company at $400 million, and over a 4.5-year period, we grew that to $1.1 billion. And completely under the radar screen. So it stretched every element of corporate competitive strategy that I had even learned in the past 20 years. So we had to evolve. So I'll share with you some of the things that we did in order to get that. That company right now is $2.2 billion. So they've doubled. I ran the company till 2016 December. Then I sat on the board for 2 years. And in the meantime, I decided that higher ed was something I wanted to enjoy. And so I took on a business school role in Southern California before I became the dean at City University. I've been at City University for about a year as the dean. So what do you do when you are looking at, next slide is, there it is. So when you are thinking about, or when I think of corporate and competitive strategy, you got to break it down into 3 layers. This is the pointer, right? Or maybe not. I'm struggling with this, aren't I? Okay. How do I get the, I'm sorry. As you can see that some of these things, I know how to run $1 billion company. I don't know how to operate a pointer. So clearly my skill sets have, or maybe it's just age. My kids will tell me it's age. And I agree, you know. I agree that at some point, it's, if you could just go back to that previous slide. Thanks. At the highest level of strategy, nations have to compete. Let me give you a simple example. I remember in 1996 was my first visit to Mexicali. And you know why I visited Mexicali? Is because Sony was making all their laptops and their computers, the PCs, in Mexicali. The entire assembly line, the factory was in Mexicali. Thank you. Doesn't mean I'll know how to do it, but thank you.
No, it was turned off.
Huh?
It was turned off.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't
Well,
working.
that would make sense. So nations at the highest level will compete against one another. I shouldn't say unfortunately. However, the pandemic has shown us what happened with manufacturing outsourcing. Mexico should be the biggest hub for manufacturing, by the way, for US. Why? We have NAFTA. The supply chain is 4 days. But look at which country has the biggest manufacturing hub, for various reasons, right? Labor, this thing, etc. China. However, if you go back and trace back to 1996, and even before, Mexico was actually the forerunner, working with US companies for nearshore. However, when you look at nations competing, I would say that the Chinese government and their strategic 5-year plans, which they are extremely, extremely good about, and of course, a ton of US help, took that manufacturing and moved it offshore, right? Supply chain became from 4 days, the supply chain went to 21 days. US companies learned how to buffer the supply chain issues that come with a supply chain that went from 4 days to 21 days. I always wonder, what would have happened if there were other processes and policies that would have been placed here or India, because there is a huge amount of technical talent in both countries. Enough raw material, and the supply chain in India is also about 20 days. However, the Indian government decided that manufacturing was not going to be a sector that they wanted to focus on. Different parties come. Politicians oftentimes will make strategic decisions, which they have the right to do. However, they decided until recently, until the current Prime Minister, who has now regenerated this Made in India, they said, you know what? We want to focus on what? IT. That was what India decided they were going to place their bet on. Which is why when the IT outsourcing wave happened, guess where most of the IT went? To India. It's tough to find a single company, a US company, European company, that probably isn't doing some element of IT outsourcing in India. You know, I'm of Indian origin, and I hate to say it, when people go, they immediately assume, because I'm Indian origin, that I must come from the IT industry, right? Stereotyping, right? And so I have to always tell people, no, I kind of went a different route, and they'll look at me and go, are you sure you're Indian? I'm like, yes, just because I'm of Indian origin doesn't mean I have to come from IT. However, the nation competed, strategically made investments, and of course, you know, we laid a ton of fiber optics, and IT went over there. That's a national strategy that then translates into business value downstream. Today, of course, there's Eastern Europe is making a lot of investments. You know, unfortunately, until the recent war that's still going on, Ukraine was coming out to be quite a hub of programming, of computer science talent. Armenia, a lot of talent in computer science. that's going on over there. And I'm sure the balance will come in. But at the highest level, national help is extremely, extremely, extremely important. And national strategy will drive corporate and competitive strategy. So when nations compete, now, sometimes nations don't have to compete. The Middle East doesn't have to compete with anybody for oil. It's a natural resource. It just gushes up, and they'll sell it to us, right? But at some point, that will end. We all know that's not going to be limitless supply. So if you think about that level, that's the highest level. At the next level, things that we can control. And when I say we, unless you're going to go into the policy making for countries, most likely you will probably end up in the corporate sector, right? Some of you may end up, in other sectors. But at the corporate level, the strategies that you need to be focused on are really around these lines, which is, what's my financial strategy? Whether we like it or not, we live in an extremely capitalist society. And I'm a big proponent, by the way, of capitalism. So if some of you are not, I apologize, but I'm too old to change. So I'm probably a little bit of a reformed capitalist these days, but I'm still a capitalist at heart, right? And there's nothing wrong with it. I don't apologize for it. But financial targets have to be part of your corporate strategy. If you ever see a strategic plan that makes you feel good, that looks good on paper, because there's a lot of pretty slides and a lot of things about I'm going to conquer the world and my brand will take over everything, I always go, where are the numbers? You know that movie, Tom Cruise movie, Show Me the Money, where Cuba Gooding Jr. goes, show me the money? I always remember that and I go, show me the money. So unless you have a sound financial background, it is not a good strategic plan. That's just the fundamentals of most of our industries. Then you look at the brand and the product goals. It's great to say that I'm going to conquer the world. So I collect watches. I'm probably a dying breed because most of you are probably, how many of you are wearing an Apple Watch today, right now? How many? Nobody? Okay, just one, two, good. And I took him watch shopping with me yesterday, just to make his life miserable. And I took him to a store, and I went to every watch counter. I made him sit down while I discussed watch movements for like 15 minutes, because I knew he wore an Apple Watch. And it just annoys me when people wear Apple Watches. So that was his punishment. Who dominates the watch industry? Any guess? Well, Rolex is the brand. Which country? Switzerland, right? Even though I would argue there's other countries that make just as good movement. Japan makes amazing movement, Seiko. Italy used to have a company called Panerai. I own one. They made some of the best movement. However, Switzerland, because of all the investments they made and all the companies that went there, Switzerland still has mind share. Germany actually makes good watches too. There's a company called Glashütte from the town of Glashütte. I own one of those watches too. And now, typical German engineering, the watches are very simple and look kind of boring, but you know they will work for the next 100 years. So, however, Switzerland took that. So let's say we have a brand that's built here in Mexico. And the CEO goes, you know what? I'm going to be the leading watch brand in the world. The chances of pulling that off, unless you are willing to put tens of millions of dollars into your marketing plan, maybe even hundreds, are probably pretty low. Because at the end of the day, you have to overcome the barrier of quality. What has Switzerland driven into us? That quality and precision equals Swiss. The other thing they've driven into us is they say they make the best chocolates, right? I'm not a chocolate fan, but everybody will tell you Swiss chocolate. Oh, love it. Whatever, it's chocolate. It's made from cocoa, tastes okay if you're a chocolate fan, but that's what they've driven into us, right? It is years and years and hundreds of millions of dollars of branding and follow through. They do make good watches. You have to overcome that. Does that mean it's not something that you can overcome? But if you're going to do that, you're going to have to fight two levels of strategy. You're going to have to figure out how to get distribution, which is your corporate strategy. And then you're going to have to figure out how does your country compete against the known, which is Switzerland. Japan, I would have argued, was probably in the best position when it came to watch movements to compete. Seiko, in Asia, even today, I grew up in India, and Seiko was like the brand we aspired for. We had two brands we aspired to, Omega and Seiko. So if you were a rich Indian, you had an Omega. If you were middle class, you had Seiko. And if you were an average Indian, you had something called HMT, which was the only Indian watch brand that existed. It was owned by the government. So can you imagine what happened to HMT? Closed down, exactly. It was owned by the government, right? So anything that is owned by the government, you know, eventually goes the way many government-owned companies go, which is they shut down, right? So when you're thinking of your strategy and somebody tells you they've got a product that's going to be the next killer, now when it comes to technology, that market is slightly different. If you look at the pandemic, I would say probably two companies took the most advantage of the pandemic to gain tremendous market share. Any idea what those two companies are? Amazon. I heard somebody say Amazon, right? Because Amazon, we had to shop online, right? Because the lines at the stores were too long. Everybody else had inventory problems. Somehow, I know my own ordering went from an average of 30 orders in a year to 30 orders a month. And Amazon was the most convenient because I would otherwise go in LA and the lines at Costco were about 2 hours long. You know, suddenly everybody said toilet paper is something they had to stock 2 years supply because I guess we were going to run out of toilet paper. I don't know. I mean, actually, I hate to say it. My wife was a physician. We've been married for many, many years. In her mind, unless I carried a year's supply of toilet paper, then I was doing some inventory management. I still have a room in my house right now, which has about a year of toilet paper that we will never use. I've been told that is her strategic safety stock. Don't ask me why. It's only her and me. The boys have gone. However, people decided, and so Amazon's growth suddenly went like this, right? And of course, what's the other company that suddenly became a globally recognized brand name that before the pandemic was okay? They were competing in that social media kind of space. During the pandemic, they experienced about 20x growth. Which one? Zoom, of course, on a platform. No, this is more something that everybody interacts with. TikTok. Before the pandemic, not too many people knew about TikTok, right? But during the pandemic, people were sitting at home. The husbands and wives didn't want to talk to one another because now they were sitting there for the rest, together all the time. And so they started watching TikTok. They started making TikTok. I eventually ended up deleting TikTok from my cell phone because I found myself sitting for an hour watching mindlessly stupid videos, right? And one of the TikTok heads actually teaches for us at CityU. And he used to be with Amazon. They hired him into TikTok. And the kind of growth that they experienced, it was not in their corporate strategy. It was not in their competitive strategy. And guess what? It was free. The users found this platform and just started going. Now, are they going to give up that market share? Probably not. Because that's one thing you have. When you have the mind share and the eyeballs, you will continue to hopefully maintain that, right? So That's one of those areas where your product and your brand suddenly went from nowhere. And keep in mind, it's a Chinese-owned company, which, if you remember, in 2016, in the US, we had a political change, and the anti-China feeling became significantly pronounced, and Trump wanted to break the company up. He wanted the US TikTok to be completely separate from China TikTok. I don't know what the truth is. I've been told if your information is on TikTok, you should assume that it has already been compromised. I don't know, I don't care. At the end of the day, if they want my name and my cell phone number, let them have it. It's okay, I'll block this thing. But when you think about it, the bottom targets are something you have to think about as any strategic plan that you do. The first one is your CAGR, C-A-G-R, cumulative aggregate growth. Year over year, what are you going to grow? You know what business has taught me? And keep in mind, UPAIP, City University of Seattle, we are all private schools. None of us have endowments. Well, maybe UPAIP does. City U does not have endowment, no endowment. Which means you being here is what is growth for us. If you are not here, which means enrollment is the highest metric for any school that is not a state school. So when I started doing work in higher ed, I was like, hold on, let's see. Endowment is like my dad giving me money and I'm not having to work for it. So that's not there. Dad hasn't given me money. I've got to go out and recruit students, and only then can I have surplus in my budget. Doesn't that sound like a business? We're in the business of higher education, aren't we? It's higher education, noble cause. But we are in the business of higher education, which means I have to be able to show year-over-year growth. Because if I'm not growing at City U in Seattle, but the market has grown, it probably means that Seattle Pacific took my market share. Or it probably means one of the other private schools took my market share. Not University of Washington, because they're a state school. They're a research one state school. I don't compete against them. When I was the assistant dean at California Lutheran University, you know, we had other privates that Pepperdine was right in my backyard, Loyola Marymount. They were the privates. We competed against the privates, which means year-over-year growth has to come in the business. One of the things I learned very early on is that if I'm not growing, but the market's growing, it means somebody else is eating my lunch. And eventually, I had a boss, an old boss. I shouldn't say old boss, former boss, right? Old boss means he was old, but he was old too. But he was my former boss. He always would say, Sumantra, and I was a partner at that point at Hitachi. He would always say, Sumantra, you can have one bad year. Everybody has a bad year. Okay, you didn't make your number. I gave you a ridiculous target, $15 million in services. You only did 12. Got it. You missed your target by 30%. He goes, I'm okay. He goes, but if you have 2 bad years in a row, then we probably are going to have a serious conversation, right? And that's something I've always maintained. We can all have one bad year. We can say, the pandemic, this, that, and the other, the housing crisis. Keep in mind, you know, in my career, I've seen 3 economic ups and downs. The first one was the dot-com bust, 2000, right? When everybody was going to become a dot-com millionaire, billionaire, gajillionaire, and then most companies went belly up. I was a partner with Ernst & Young at that point. That was my first year as a partner. I had to lay off 36% of my workforce, 36%. Every Friday, the partners would get on a call, and if I couldn't bill you, let's say you were my consultant, I didn't have a project for you in 2 weeks out, you were gone. The second economic downturn I saw was 2008, the housing crisis. At that point, I was a partner with Hitachi. We laid off 26% of our workforce, primarily because the couple of sectors just got destroyed. What I learned over these things is the safest sectors, the ones that are recession resistant. There is no recession-proof sector, but there are certain sectors that tolerate recession a lot better than others. Number one is food. People will always need to eat. And the second is healthcare. And the third is something I learned when I was having a discussion with the chairman of Mattel. You know, the toy company? Brian Stockton. Brian used to be at Oscar Mayer Craft, and then he was running Mattel. And I began my career there, so it was going to be a bad year. It was the financial crisis. So I asked Brian, I said, this was 2008. I said, Brian, are you going to have a bad fourth quarter? He said, no. He said, I think my fourth quarter will be just the same as last year. I said, but what's going on? He said, toys have unfortunately become a category where parents will cut other things in order to make sure that their kids have the toys to play with. He goes, so much as it sounds really perverse, my category may have gone into a recession-resistant category, as opposed to a category that was largely a disposable income category, because of the mindset of the parents and the fact that we tend to spoil our children probably more than my parents spoiled me, for certain. We spoil our children a lot. We certainly do. I have two boys, but they're old now. But I'm sure, I know parenting these days is different than parenting back in the older days, right? And I've been told that we have so much to learn, and that our parents did everything wrong. No, we all turned out okay. So our parents did something right? Return on invested capital. Another big measure when you think about corporate strategy. If you're putting in money, 10 million into a project, I'm going to need you to show me the return out of that project. And some projects may have a 20-year shelf life. Putting up the Volkswagen plant, there's a Volkswagen plant here, right? That probably had a 20-year ROI. Because those kind of capital investments you don't get in 1 year, 2 years. But let's say he wants to make an investment in international education here. I can guarantee you he's not going to be given 20 years to show a return. He's probably going to be given 1, maybe 2, depending on if he caught the president in a good day or a bad day. Right? So at the end of the day, all of us have to show return on invested capital. And then the final thing that has to be part of every strategic document, unless you have strange ownership where the predominant owner is going to call all the shots, shareholder interests are extremely important to manage. Especially minority shareholders. Minority shareholder interests have to be protected. There are laws in the US, there are laws in Europe, I'm sure there's laws in Mexico as well, that protect minority shareholder interests. And you need to make sure that your other measures are not ones that are only going to benefit a certain segment of shareholders, your preferred stockholders, or your restricted stockholders, or your voting stockholders. When I was running Abu Dhabi company, I used to buy companies all over the world, and I had a very simple formula. I would buy 70 to 80%, and then I would leave 20% or 30% for the local company. Every time I did that, I knew that decisions that I made from Abu Dhabi, I never lived in Abu Dhabi, by the way, I would just fly. I lived in LA. Decisions that I made based out of Abu Dhabi, I needed to make sure that my minority shareholders, who were not benefiting from all the excess money I was making in Abu Dhabi, they were measured on their local P&L, that their 30% was protected. Because if I didn't protect their 30%, I could be opening myself up to shareholder lawsuits. So you've got to be very careful when you put your strategic plan together that your financial metrics and your plans do not violate certain shareholder objectives. Then if you have gotten to this point where now you're at the business unit level, at the business unit level, it's somewhat different. Because the corporate, more often than not, will set you the overall goal. If you're Pepsi, whether you like it or not, Pepsi will set their goals out of Dallas or New York, And Gamesa would inherit those goals. Because as part of Pepsi, I think they might still be part of Pepsi unless they were sold, but they would inherit a derived metric. So if Pepsi said, globally my snack division has to grow at 8%, and Mexico happens to be 20% of my global portfolio, then highly likely Mexico will have to deliver 1.6%, because that would be Mexico's contribution to the overall snack food growth. Right? So more often than not, at the business unit level, you are not going to be in charge of your entire destiny. You'll be in charge of how to get that 1.6% in the local market. You know, do you invest more in Mexico City? Do you go into other places? But the fact that that 1.6% has to be delivered, that one you will not have control over. Why? Because that has been set by this. And if they have decided that they're going to put a new plant in Mexico City or somewhere, then guess what? Those metrics, which will come out from here, will also be imposed on your business unit. So what are you seeing? You're seeing this funnel. And the lower in the funnel you are, the less in control you are of your own destiny, right? I'm sure if I spoke to the international division here, you guys would say, well, some of the decisions are just made that side of the house. We don't even know what they think. At California Lutheran, the academics, we used to be on this side, and the administration used to be across the pond, literally across a small pond. And we used to go, okay, there's the pond. That was made across the pond. They have no idea what the hell they're doing, but they make these decisions, and then they throw it across the pond to us. It was not true, but it sounded good, especially if we wanted to complain about administration, right? So, but these are some of the goals that at the business unit level you will have. You will also have year-over-year growth. If you are in the for-profit sector, you will have year-over-year growth. If you're in the not-for-profit sector, you still have growth targets. I did some work for Girl Scouts. Girl Scouts is one of the largest organizations, at least in the US. And if you've ever worked with Girl Scout, you will know that there is one event in the year that makes about 75% of their revenue. That's when they go out selling cookies. In the US, during the month of February and March, you cannot walk into a grocery store or a school without a Girl Scout pushing boxes of cookies. And then you feel compelled to buy like 5 boxes, even though you will never eat it. But however, and that, by the way, for Girl Scout LA, and the CFO used to work with me at Ernst & Young, 75% of her yearly budget came out of that cookie sale. So even though she's not for profit, if they didn't sell enough cookies, they had a bad year. And so cookie sales were I learned very quickly that cookie sales were very, very important. And I also learned very quickly that, you know, these little youngsters, they look really innocent, but they are sharks. They are there to push box after box after box of cookie to you many times over, not just once. You know, when sometimes you'll push it once and then you'll go, okay, I've already pushed it. No. They will push it. He comes back again. They will push him again. And they will say, okay, today I didn't do well. He'll go, okay, fine. You know, we'll buy more. So here he walks away with 2 more boxes. And before you know it, he wanted to buy 0. He's now sitting on 10 boxes of shortbread cookies, which he will never touch. And each box costs $5, so he spent $50, right? But so the other thing that if you are doing a business unit strategy, and especially if you're part of a global company, you have to insist on some element of localization. If you do not insist on localization, there are story after story of how global messaging doesn't translate into local messaging. So if you're selling snack food, even though you could be selling maybe, say, Frito, which is, you know, Frito-Lay's big brand, the local packaging here in Mexico will look very different. You know, maybe the color. I remember I was in one business where we wanted to show the Chinese market that we really understood their market. Chinese New Year comes every year in the month of January, right? And if you have Chinese students in the month of January, they'll have every excuse why they're not going to attend class because they're out partying, even if they're sitting in the US, right? So we said, during that month, what's a great color in that month? Red. We said, for the month of January up to February, we're actually going to package our product in sleeves that are red. The rest of the year, our packaging was either in green or white sleeves. So we made that decision, which made a lot of sense for localization. But guess where now my problems came into? In my supply chain. Because now I had to segregate the product. I had to make sure the China product was packed separately. I had to make sure I had ordered enough red sleeves because I didn't want to be sitting on red sleeves for the rest of the year. So now I created a localization strategy, which hopefully got me more sales. Nobody ever measured it because sometimes you don't measure. But you created a supply chain and operational issue, right? So here was a simple target out here that was on localization that made it different. So as you're looking through these, you have to now keep in mind one thing. If he's developing his international strategy, because that's what he's responsible for here, guess what? He can't think that he's doing it in a vacuum. Because if he's developing it, his competitor is probably also developing an international strategy. Which means every chevron that I just talked to you about, you have to think, when I make this move, what is my competitor going to respond with? If I cut my price, am I going into a pricing war? The tobacco industry is known for pricing wars. You want to go fight against Philip Morris or what's called Altria now, and you want to take on their brand Marlboro, and you want to go into a price war? Many companies have tried. They have lost. Because Philip Morris has $100 million stored in order to beat this thing. Last year, 3 years ago, I invested in a consumer products company. Great brand. They were making essentially baking mixes, and they were doing decent product. And the CEO had a good strategy. Suddenly, the CEO decided that there was a need in the college students to make cupcakes, which you can just put into a cup, literally, put water, stick it in a microwave, and suddenly you had ready-to-eat cupcake, right? And she called it Instant Indulgence. Great name, right? I saw the packaging. I'm sitting here going, okay, I get it. She actually sacrificed a launch of another product that we had, which was going to go into the military bases, to launch this product. We said, no problem, do it. Wrong decision. She was putting 3 in a box, and her first listing was Walmart. She actually got store orders right at Walmart. Right? You get store orders at Walmart, you're pretty excited. Within a month, can you guess what happened? Take a guess. There's a company in the US called Duncan Hines. They're the leader in the baking goods category. They saw the product and they were like, that's a pretty cool product. They launched their own version of Instant Indulgence, except they put 4 packets in a box. And they priced it 20 cents less than Cherryvale Farms. 4 months later, Cherryvale Farms filed for bankruptcy. Any of you eat pickles? It's kind of disgusting, but I'm glad you eat it. Vlasic used to be one of the best-known pickle companies. They were a division of Campbell Soup. They were spun out of Campbell. Walmart was their biggest customer. They did about 85% of their sales through Walmart. Walmart looked at the pickle category, went to Vlasic and said, I need you to supply me 50% more product at 40% less price. That's it. That was their mandate. It didn't matter whether it was achievable, not. Vlasic was like, that's not achievable. The Walmart said, we don't care. We have other suppliers that will actually supply. They may not have the brand of Vlasic, but guess what? We don't believe the brand really matters. Vlasic disagreed. A year later, what do you think happened to Vlasic? Bankrupt. Gone. I've seen retailers like Walmart and Costco build companies to $1 billion and kill companies. Costco, I don't know if Costco is popular here. I assume they are. If you think 5 years back, there was a company that was everywhere in Costco at the electronics level. It's called Vizio, V-I-Z-I-O. Remember Vizio? So Vizio was actually based out of Irvine. They were one of my clients, owned by a couple of South Korean guys, brothers, grew up in the US. Grew to over $1 billion on the backs of Costco. Do you think there's Vizio in Costco anymore? Gone. Costco replaced them with Samsung and everything else. So keep in mind, so when you are thinking of your strategy, even your partners, which is your retailers, they could become competitors. You know why? Because the retailers have their home brands. Or they can decide, today I put Vizio into business, tomorrow I'm going to put Vizio 2 into business. Because Vizio 1 isn't giving me the pricing. So guess what? You want to launch Vizio 2? Okay, you're going to have a ride. So when you're thinking competitive, you have to think not just competitive in your sector. You have to go, what's downstream going to do? And are my suppliers going to be able to keep up? Keep in mind, no supply chain is only one level. And none of us manufacture everything. The automotive sector is a great example. So when you're thinking strategy, when you're thinking all these levels, keep in mind, if you, I think it was Newton's law of motion, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So when you're making a strategic move, there will be a strategic move that will be made against you. Maybe you've already accounted for it, but you will have a reaction from your partners. So what happens if you are now at the functional unit? How am I doing on time? 10 minutes, okay. Sometimes you can compete on what's called capabilities. Amazon is a great example. When they started, what did they compete on? They competed on fulfillment excellence. Apart from the fact that when they got into the book business, they actually didn't have inventory issue. Why? Because they passed most of their inventory back to the publishers. Sometimes you can turn your capability. If you're excellent at supply chain, maybe you can create a business out of that. EDS, Electronic Data Systems, which was General Motors' internal IT department. Ross Perot, strange man, ran for US President once, was about this big, had the most nasally voice you could ever find, annoying as hell to hear on TV. He said, you know what, I'm just going to buy that entire IT division from General Motors, bought it, got a 25-year contract or something with GM to provide IT services, and then created a global, like $6 or $7 billion company, which HP ended up buying. That was a capability, and his view was GM is in the business of making cars. Not very good cars, but cars. I'm not a GM fan. I think they make okay cars. But the fact is, they are not in the business of IT. IT was nothing but a distraction for them. So let me take the distraction away from you, and he created a whole business out of it. So sometimes when you are looking at your strategy, and you look at a department and you go, boy, they are doing an unbelievably great job. But do I really need them? Can I use them? And if the answer is maybe they're better served outside and maybe they can offer the services to other people, that's probably one where your capability now can become a business unit. What's a great example of that right now? AWS. AWS didn't exist 5, 6 years ago, 7 years ago. It was something Amazon developed because Amazon needed to develop it for their own usage. And look at what is going on now. AWS is now one of the largest revenue streams in Amazon. And the president of AWS is now the president or CEO of all of Amazon. That's a great example of a capability that became a competitive advantage that then became a whole business altogether and has transformed Amazon from being largely an e-commerce company to being an e-com platform provider. So sometimes your strategy you get when you haven't even thought about it, it just so happens that you ended up getting it. When you develop your strategy, you have got to think about duration because, and I call it telescoping. Telescoping just means that, in a telescope, it's the different lens. Your long-range plans have to be longer duration than your business unit plans, than your function unit plans. What the duration is based on, it depends on you. Some companies love creating 5-year plans, updating it. I think universities like creating 5-year plans, and then they update it or not. Your mid-range largely is in the 3 to 5 years. And your short term is 1 to 2 years. So when you're thinking of strategy, you now have to go, is it corporate, is it competitive? Probably both. What level am I doing it at? And what's the duration? How far do I have to go? So that's called the telescoping. I would not be doing justice to any strategy presentation if I didn't highlight these 3 frameworks that I have used many times in my variation. Michael Porter's 5 forces, one of the most common ones. He has probably made 10 million out of each box, because he created it. And by the way, he wrote this when he was in his early 30s, like 31 or 32. The next one that I've used a lot is a Boston Consulting Group growth matrix. Essentially, what it says is that market share and market growth. If your market share is low and the market isn't growing, it's called a dog. You need to get out of that market. Because why be in the market? You have low share and the market itself isn't growing. Why bother? Get out of the market. What you want to focus on is the top line, which is where your market share is high and your market growth is high. These are called cash cows, where you've got high market share, but it's not a growing market. But you're still making money. So make no investments in it. That's why it's a cash cow. But pull the money out. So that's what BCG came up with. And I've used this a lot as I've had to restructure businesses. Recently, this article came out. I'm assuming many of you have heard about the Blue Ocean Strategy. It came out of INSEAD. The 2 professors were out of INSEAD, are. And they said, look, sometimes things come. You're either in a red ocean, which means there's other competitors, and you're essentially swimming with the sharks. That's why it's a red ocean. Or you've created something that doesn't exist at all. That's called a blue ocean, right? One could argue that AWS came out as somewhat of a blue ocean. Salesforce, the tech company in CRM, when Salesforce, Mark Benioff, who is now, it's become one of the most highest valued companies, he actually used to work at Oracle. He went to Larry Ellison and said, I have this idea of creating an online customer relationship management system. Ellison said, I'm a database company, I have applications, but this is so far out that I don't think this is a good fit for us. However, if you do it, I will personally invest in your company. That's how Salesforce was born. Oracle had the right to have owned Salesforce today, whose market capitalization is some obscene number, but because it didn't fit their mindset, they allowed Benioff to go off and create essentially what became a blue ocean. So sometimes blue oceans do come up. TikTok, maybe a blue ocean. Whoever thought that 10-second, 15-second videos were important? I remember when I was at Cal Lutheran, I placed my first business school ad on TikTok because I had a whole bunch of Chinese students, and they said, hey, there's this thing called TikTok. I was like, what is TikTok? They actually got their own drone. They took a picture of our entire campus, and they posted it on TikTok. This was like 5 years ago. Now I think all business schools are putting stuff on TikTok, right? So these sometimes become blue oceans. So keep in mind, once in a while, you have to recognize that there is that innovator out there who is probably creating that next killer app. Just like Bob Eckert created Lunchables when none of us thought it was going to work, there's always that one out there. I have my own adaptation of it. I always go, I don't need a blue ocean. Maybe I just want a blue lake. Everything doesn't have to be an ocean. I'm okay if it's blue, it's not red, and I'm okay if it's a small lake, because I can make a lot of money even out of a lake. When you think of strategy, my final slide, you have to have three elements. There is people. We are still, until the robots take over, and Will Smith makes a movie that talks about robots and doesn't slap Chris Rock on stage, and some of us go watch his movie. Until then, people, very, very important. Peter Drucker, amazing management thinker. His classic comment was, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And who embodies culture? It's the people. Your president could come up with the best plan. But if the rest of you don't want to implement it, good luck to getting it implemented. You know, how many people are you going to fire? He can't fire the whole university. He or she can't fire the whole university. People, very, very, very important. And then process and technology. You have to be disciplined, especially if you're going to scale. You have to have the right process. And more often than not these days, you have to have some element of technology, because technology is part and parcel. As you saw in her presentation, technology is in our everyday life, right? And the final thing, answer those questions. Who's going to do it? At universities, we love launching new projects and just putting it on his plate, even though his plate is overflowing and he can't even get to what he's got. But you know what? We'll just put it on his plate, because that's what we do. We never hire, and we just add stuff. How long is it going to take? Put a time box. And then the final question is, how are you going to measure success? What are your key performance indicators? So all these questions over my career, I've had to time box these into presentations, execution plan, and it's worked more than it hasn't. Let's put it this way. Have I had huge failures? No, well, I've had failures. Not huge ones, but I've had failures. However, every time I failed, I've learned something new for the next time around. So thank you for your time.
On time. Thank you, Dr. Sengupta, for that amazing lecture. We'll now have a space for question and answer, requesting the audience to ask their questions directly. Is there any questions? Oh, Massimo.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the presentation. It was really great and all the insights. I have a question regarding planning and how it's changing in volatile times. So are we going to experience more volatile times? So how is planning changing? That's my big question.
So look, I started my career on the planning side. And I used to be very rigid, right, on planning. What I learned over my career as it evolved is that planning is never going to go away. However, maybe instead of planning 100%, which doesn't exist, that's why it's a plan, maybe you plan scenarios. So I became a big proponent of proposing 70 or 80% plans and leaving 20 to 30% for that buffer. There's a concept in supply chain called drum, buffer, rope. And I always said, instead of having a drum that is 100%, give yourself a drum that is 70% and give yourself a buffer for 20, and then let the executive have 10% to hang himself or herself. Right? So drum, buffer, rope. So very important, but being agile and being able to adapt has become more important, especially because of all these disruptions that we are. So I have an article coming out in November where I talk about how the new norm of companies and how they're going to handle risk in their entire supply chain, all the way, the value chain. So, and in that I talk about some frameworks that are going to be somewhat counterintuitive to our core planning constructs. But my hope is that risk management will drive the next generation of agile planning. So that's, great question, by the way.
Thanks, Dr. Sengupta. There's a question on the online page.
Okay.
If it says, it is okay to have corporate strategy based on ethics, even if it means to sacrifice some utilities?
That is such, great question, whoever's asking that. Ethics have to be everywhere, because at the end of the day, my assumption, just like economists make assumption on, on data, my assumption is that your fundamental business model is ethical. And if that doesn't exist, then it doesn't really matter. You shouldn't be developing a strategy. You should be out of business. I would argue that lately some of the crypto bankruptcies that have happened, they were large pyramid schemes. They were not built on ethical business practices. So ethics is the starting point. Sure. And I assume, and that always is a bad word, right? Because what's the full form of assume? Do you guys know what the full form of assume is?
I don't know.
No? Oh, come on. Assume, A-S-S-U-M-E. It makes an ass out of you and me. Come on. How could you not know assume? So anytime I always say assume, I always go, yep. So I assume that most generally people will be ethical. My other famous line is hope is not a strategy. Every time people will go, oh, we hope this thing. I go, oh, sorry, hope is not a strategy. So,
thanks so much. Well, we're run out of time. We thank Dr. Sengupta for his collaboration and excellent lecture, and present him with our appreciation and a simple gift. And please, let's give him a warm applause.
Very nice. Let's get a picture together.
Yeah, okay.
Sure.
Over there.
It's
It's a video. Okay, let's get a video together. Thank you. Well, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me. It was an absolute pleasure.
Sure.
Thanks. Take care.